Soul Searching is a series of audacious podcasts that challenge the way we instinctively think and react. Often without our noticing, the world shapes us through education, media narratives, and social memes. We rarely get to question our assertions and opinions, so let me ask the awkward questions, poke holes in rigid beliefs, and propose lateral alternatives to the way we were taught to think. You might disagree with me, and that is okay. Soul searching is not about reaching conclusions, but about offering one a chance to hear a different perspective. What matters most is that we keep challenging, keep talking, and keep learning together. Here, debate isn't a battle over who is right. It's an opportunity to ponder, to see the world a little differently, and to broaden our personal understanding about ourselves and the role we have in this universe. If something in this episode unsettles you, there is space on the podcast's webpage to share your views. In this episode, we take an unflinching look at our most primal sense, touch. Here we explore sensitive themes around touch, shame, and vulnerability. At birth, touch begins so naturally and innocently. Yet as we grow up, events, fears, and taboos often begin to weave shame into our skin. From the innocence of a child's need for comfort, through layers of explorative experiments, seeking attention and expressing desire, some more perilous than others, human contact can start to feel claustrophobic and threatening. However, it is possible to trace how the body learns to guard itself and to withdraw from the very connections it craves. We look at what happens when tenderness is taught to hide, and how, even after decades of caution, the body is able to learn to trust again. For some, the story may be painful, both physically and emotionally, but it might also lead to the rediscovery and celebration of one's ability to touch and be touched, thereby bringing about healing and allowing one to find the quiet courage it takes to reach back out towards another. Where has touch felt safe or unsafe in your own experience? As I sipped my coffee this morning, my old dog Bova came over, stuck his nose under my arm, and nudged my wrist. He does this often, neither being demanding nor impatient, just gently reminding me that he is there. He knows the value of touch and is uninhibited in seeking tactile contact with me. Without thinking, I ran my fingers through his fur. In that small, wordless moment, something in both of us connected. A passing subconscious thought then awoke in my awareness. How wonderfully innocent and uncomplicated it is for Bova to seek my caress that is so assuring. A sequence beginning with a need for affirmation, followed by a pat to let him know that I am there, and ending in a flow of neurochemicals in the brain that pleases and deepens the bond between us. Once that thought dissipated, a strange residue of an awkward, undefinable sadness remained. It left me pondering two questions. When did touch become a thing so hard for me to seek and receive? And when did something so simple become so fraught with hesitation, suspicion, even dread? The emotion washed over me like a wave on a beach, feeling both like an unfulfilled need and a lament. It was a sudden longing for a guiltless touch, the kind that meets those unimpeachable needs before it has had chance to become something darker and more sinister. Of course, the only thing that gives me agency is to speak about myself. Yet I can only imagine how free and easy it is for many who enjoy unabashed touch, while for others who were molested, bullied, and abused, touch has become frigid, horrifying, and brittle. I guard my own skin as if it were private property, because, in my case, touch exposes a deeply vulnerable and unguarded part of myself. What keeps surprising me most isn't my immediate and instinctive recoil from touch, but the depth of turmoil caused by it and how easily and masterfully I have learned to hide my reflexes. Of course I yearn for affectionate touch, and under certain conditions, when the moment is right, it feels tender, safe, and almost sacred. Yet it teeters precariously because there are many moments when a deeply inculcated memory suddenly triggers something indefinable, and in an instant, like a mousetrap snapping shut, affectionate touch retreats, giving way to an entanglement of shame, repulsion, and awkward panic, all fighting for breath and frantically seeking an escape. There are two opposing forces at play, and only one may find expression in the moment. One is shy, romantic, vulnerable, and expressive. The other is self-protective, withdrawn, and mute. The former is tentative, sometimes lustful, often driven out of need, like an itch that pleads to be scratched. The latter, when triggered, is snappy. It has power to suppress any requirement for innocent touch. It shows up as disgust, while really being fear in disguise, not the kind with clear distinction. Affectionate touch shifts quickly. All at once, it gives way to a primitive fear of being seen, the fear of being known, the fear of exposure, and the fear of sinfulness. It's deeply confusing because the body wants it. Every cell leans into it as my skin wakes up. Yet another part of me, the part trained to survive disapproval and rejection, slams on the brakes. That kind of reaction doesn't come out of nowhere. I long to surrender to it, but I freeze. My body goes into high alert before the part of me that knows I'm safe even gets a chance to awaken. This is the echo of early lessons absorbed long before I had words for them. As an ill toddler, touch was painful, forbidden, and withheld. Throughout my upbringing, I learned that the body was a vehicle for temptation and sin. As a teenager, my affectionate feelings stood apart from convention. And my parents, who were of the old-fashioned kind, cringed with horror at any public display of affection. Their love finding expression through restraint and hidden duty rather than through skin. For me, touch isn't creepy. It's more of an invasion, not from the outside, but from within. Touch is a tenderness that my system still interprets as threat, and I don't yet have a tidy answer to why this happens. As I patted Bova and twiddled his ear, I realized that I'm much safer and wiser now, even though my muscle memory hasn't caught up properly. Yet I knew for the first time that an opportunity lay ahead to find holistic symmetry. Needing to find a break from the emotional anguish that had washed upon shore, I did what I often do, focus my thoughts on the psychology of it all. It's a safer space, cerebral and controlled, a coping mechanism that lets me step out of the abstract and into the concrete fact. Touch is one of our five senses, a vital one at that. Long before we had words, we had skin. Touch was our first language, the way we came to know safety, belonging, and love. Infants don't learn to trust from what people say. They learn it through what they feel. The skin isn't just a boundary between our inner and outer world. It's our first point of contact with the world. Every brush, every hold, every soothing gesture teaches us something about whether the world is safe enough to relax into. Physical contact, in its simplest form, like the way I touched Bova, is a reminder that touch isn't optional. It's as essential to our emotional development and well-being as food, shelter, and education. When I think back, the first lesson probably came when I was still a toddler. Weakened, I nearly succumbed to eczema, but my mother's love kept me alive. She couldn't hold me. Her touch was fire to fragile skin. Love had to travel another route. Maybe that's where the confusion began, when comfort and pain arrived in the same package. I often wonder how many of us grew up that way. Not unloved, just untouched. and how later we may have mistaken tactile tenderness for danger. I poured another coffee while my mind connected more of the dots, tracing an outline that predisposed my awkwardness with touch. I must have been about 12. My sister was a few years younger. We were on the back seat of the car. Mum and Dad had taken us to the drive-in because they wanted to see Gone with the Wind. In the final scene, Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh embrace and kiss each other on the beach. That closing scene caused my mother much anguish. "Cover the children," she whispered to my dad. And just like that, without a word, he threw the blanket over our heads. They must not see such a blatant display of affection. I remember lying there in the dark, peeking out from under that blanket, wondering what all the fuss was about. Open affection wasn't allowed in our world. Perhaps it was even too dangerous for Mum and Dad. But here's the thing. That tiny moment wired into me somehow, and I still feel it. Both parents carried that reserve in their bodies, especially my mother. Hugging her was like hugging an ironing board. Straight-backed, unyielding, and radiating the heat of anguish rather than the warmth of tenderness. She expressed her love through action, not embrace. My brain accepted the imprint that tender, affectionate touch is taboo. When two signals fire together in the same heartbeat, the need and the inappropriateness, it easily shapes how we handle closeness later in life, wanting to reach out, but also having to pull back. Looking back, I see my mother's reaction through the lens of her faith and her culture. She was protecting us the only way she knew how. But to my young nervous system, it was simply mixed messaging at full volume. Closeness exposes too much. It's only after decades of introspection that I realized my body has obeyed that night's instruction, getting the message that affection means disapproval. So it's better not to be seen, not to be known, not to be exposed, but to stay safely under the blanket. For many, touch is a truly touchy topic. A father once told me how frightened he was of touching his children, not because he harbored any wrong intent, but because society had made him feel awkward and self-conscious when doing so. Even with his wife, touch had become constrained. Their intimacy had faded, replaced by distance, and he mourned the closeness that they once knew. While touch is one strand in the fabric of lovemaking, it is not the only one. Tease apart a thread from a skein of wool and you'll see that it is made up of finer filaments twisted together. Each adds strength and texture, yet each can be drawn apart and examined on its own. The same is true of intimacy. There is touch, the sensory language of care and recognition. There is the act itself, the biological, passionate dance between bodies. And there is the silent communication beneath it all, the exchange of safety, tenderness, curiosity, surrender, and trust. These are distinct threads, though we usually spin them together. Yet somewhere along the way, humanity's desire for a spiritual yardstick took those separable threads and twisted them so tightly that they became one inseparable cord. In doing so, properness made the entire skein feel tainted. Cognitive awareness of our morality, measured against spiritual standards of purity and chastity, turned what was once our purest language of innocent connection into a need to conform. Binding ourselves to these moral standards, we remain under constant surveillance. The body, once seen as our tactile interface to the world, became morally charged as a site of temptation, introducing the risk of depravity. And touch, even in its innocence, found itself condemned by association. Little wonder that Mum and Dad, secure in their faith, might have been too afraid to let tenderness cross the invisible lines drawn by what they believed was right. They believed that intimate touch is clearly endorsed, but solely within the context of marriage. giving me a framework that saw touch as something needing boundaries. This kind of double encoding is powerful. It teaches the developing brain that touch, especially affectionate or romantic touch, is both desirable and dangerous, magnetic and taboo. That disparity rarely appears consciously. It lives as tension in the body, the urge to reach out and the reflex to pull back, both firing simultaneously. I always erred in favor of no touch, rather than risking the accusation of impropriety or misunderstood intention. It's safer to hide under the blanket than it is to be seen and touched. The paradox of protective distance is that sometimes we refrain from touching not out of rejection of another, but out of love. We hold back to avoid pain, to respect boundaries, to preserve dignity. Yet this restraint can itself become a quiet kind of loss. I often wonder how much of my adult reluctance to touch comes from the body's memory of pain and wounded skin, and how much stems from the cultural memory of faith and its taboos. There are moments when I long for freedom in my physical expression, yet find myself confined by internalized rules and a sense of unease. However, there is yet another layer that complicates touch even more. The self-protective maxim I learned early, that physical intimacy provokes disapproval, so curiosity must be hidden. Over time, that blend of secrecy, arousal, and inhibition hardens into the emotional principles we call taboo. It was around the time when Mum prevented us from witnessing the final beach scene in Gone with the Wind when I began transitioning into adulthood. As it happened, my attraction leaned towards other men. While I knew no label by which to define myself, I sensed that it was forbidden both within our religion and criminalized under apartheid South African law. It was during these post-puberty years when touch began to carry a different meaning, and one that also came with immense personal risk of being exposed. I dared not allow truth about myself to leak into the public domain, as the consequences would have been catastrophic. These parts of me that longed for touch had to, by their very nature, remain hidden. That's a brutal kind of conditioning because it doesn't merely suppress sexual expression. It fractures the very capacity for safe intimacy. Touch becomes synonymous with danger, exposure, even annihilation. The consolidation of the pain of touching inflamed skin, the censorship of touch under a blanket, and the erasure of a vital part of oneself meant that love and touch were no longer innocent. Now at the age of 73, a new kind of awkwardness around touch arises. Touch among the elderly can seem suspect, even a little creepy. In my youth, I had a stereotyped, rather myopic sense that the elderly forewent closeness, let alone indulge in moments of intimacy. It seemed unimaginable back then that the elderly would even experience arousal within the fragility of a fading body. I imagined that lust remained in the minds of the aged as one of those 7 deadly sins, without finding expression. That awful term, dirty old man, comes to mind, whatever that is supposed to imply. It also seemed repugnant back then when an octogenarian widow and widower fell in love and got married. Yet as a therapist and coach, I have met several elderly persons who tell me that skin hunger doesn't fade with age. It deepens, and I'm beginning to sense that for myself. Regular platonic touch, such as hugs, massage, and a steady hand on the shoulder, lowers blood pressure, eases anxiety, and dissolves loneliness. I know of single older gay men who, out of fear and necessity, denounce their sexuality and metaphorically return to the closet from whence they once emerged. Why? Because it's safer for them to present asexually when prejudice and bigotry come from others within some frail care facilities. When the world tells you that your way of touching or loving is unacceptable, how do you keep tenderness alive? How do you unlearn the reflex of shame that eclipses desire? Is it possible to separate touch from fear once they've been fused for decades? And how do we reclaim touch, not merely as physical contact, but as permission to be seen? We have at least one tangible reference that shines a light of hope, particularly for older gay men who refuse to hide. In gay society, the notion of daddies challenges broader societal narratives about aging. While mainstream culture often sidelines older individuals, gay society highlights the strength of intergenerational connections and romance. The term doesn't denote parentage, but symbolizes grounded masculinity, dependability, and a celebration of lived experience. It fosters the idea of care, connection, and mentorship. The more mature a man is, for most men, the more aware they are in life. This is an encouraging reframing of the role of the elderly, particularly where society sees age as end of life, instead of seeing it as a placeholder of wisdom. In those cases, like mine, where there is a dichotomy between moral taboos and one's natural need for affectionate touch, somatic therapy, sometimes called consensual touch healing, offers one path to reintroduce the innocence and beauty of affirmative, infinite touch in one's life. Such work often unsettles those who have known touch only through the lens of sex or sin, making it truly difficult for one to engage in such healing. Yet if one can overcome this fear and reluctance, even with a little proactive counseling, it quickly restores the body's right to safe, affirming contact. After years of being told that touch is dangerous, the nervous system forgets how to tell safe from unsafe. Healing begins by slowing down, breathing, relearning that being held need not mean harm. The skin and fascia carry memory. These healing practices help them learn new stories. In a way, it closes the loop, bringing touch from a place of pain and prohibition to a space where it can heal and celebrate. Maybe the antidote isn't to touch less, but to grant ourselves permission to touch and be touched, consciously. This applies equally to families, friendships, and in the tender territory of aging. It might be what it takes for a body that has known only guarded touch to learn to relax. Every answer opens a door to a deeper question. Remember, it isn't agreement that connects and enlightens us, it's curiosity. If something stirred in you while listening, a question, a discomfort, a flicker of recognition, stay with it. That's where real change or deeper conviction begins to take root. If something in this episode unsettled you, there's space on the podcast's webpage to share your reflections with others. I'm Tom Budge.